several years ago when I was in the state senate, and this was a life-changing event for us. In what we learned, the connections that we made at this event that have lasted throughout the time that I've been in public service, and the connectivity between different states, the legislatures of different states. Many of us continue to work on similar type projects. When I went back into the state senate, we would compare what's working, what isn't working, and how to actually get legislation through. And so this is just an incredible opportunity to not just cherish the moments that you're here, but to continue with those relationships going forward. And man, I don't know about you, but the word we had last night, man, that was meaningful, right? Because you're in it.
You're in it.
If there's ever been a time in history that you've been in it, you're in it right now. And as I travel across the state of Georgia and actually other areas, one of the consistent messages I've been giving people is to where we are today in this nation is we're winning. And they look at me like I'm crazy. How can you think we're winning with all the turmoil that we have? With the oppression that we, as conservatives, as Christians, with the oppression that we're receiving. I mean, if one person say, have you actually looked at your Facebook page? And the reality is no, because I want to have a good, positive day, you know, I want to rejoice and be glad in the day, so I stay away from Facebook so my wife reads it, and if it's just something well over the top, or if it's another threat, she'll let me know about it, but I can usually tell. When she first started, she told me, you've got to stay off Facebook. I want to start reading your Facebook posts. I have a press team that actually works on putting the things out there, and we kind of rate the head explosion that we're going to get from the left by what we put on there. When she first started reading it, I could just tell it was really bad, because I mean, sometimes it brings her to tears. But now she laughs at those things. I mean, it's how God has worked, and one of the reasons that I can say that we're winning is something that my dad told me. My dad was a medic in World War II, he was in the Army, participated in the D-Day invasion, was assigned to Patton's Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, he saw the worst of humanity. And he told me something. He said, when they were preparing for the invasion of Normandy, and they were training in England, he said the Nazis weren't shooting at us, not from Normandy. He said when we got on the ships to cross the channel, the Nazis weren't shooting at us from Normandy. When we boarded the landing craft, they weren't shooting at us from Normandy. But as soon as we started taking their ground, that's when they started shooting at us. And the more ground they took, the more intense the battle was. And the fact that we're going through this level of fighting tells us we're winning. We're taking ground. We're a threat to the other side. We should worry when everything is peaceful and calm, because then we're not creating waves and we're not creating problems in the spirit of darkness. I don't know if he really understood what he was saying. But the gentleman who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, President Donald Trump, said something I think was providential. He said, we're going to win, and you're going to get tired of winning. What I don't think he understood, or maybe he did, was you don't win without fighting. You know, and your fight has to go all the way through to the final minutes and final seconds. If you don't believe that, just come to Atlanta and watch the Falcons play in the Super Bowl, right? You can't only fight for 3/4 of the football game and then give up, especially when you're fighting against a team such as the Patriots. You will lose. And so we can't be weary in our battle. We can't be weary going forward, but understanding that we're fighting a spiritual warfare. Mm-hmm. and that God will prepare you for being in it. My wife and I experienced some, I'll say, interesting things over the period of about a year and a half. Now, Tim mentioned one of those. It was June the 14th, 2017. I play on the Congressional Baseball Team. Most of America didn't realize we had a Congressional Baseball game. It's a charity game. We actually play at the Washington National Stadium. It's the same if you watched any of the World Series. As I was watching one of the games of the World Series, I realized, man, I stood at that plate. I was actually on the field. That's pretty amazing. And so it's Republicans versus Democrats. We practice for about 3 or 4 months out of the year to play one game. We always say the opening, the season opener, and the final game is all in one game. So we do all this practice to play one game. June the 14th was the last practice. It was Flag Day. Usually the last practice, you don't have the full attendance. Some guys, the earlier that we start practicing, the more injuries we sustain. Okay? Usually, let's see, I think this year we had a torn groin, dislocated shoulder, and a heart attack. Oh, just during practices. So some guys, if we get closer to the game, they feel that, you know, I've made it through this far, I'm going to skip practice. That morning I was surprised as we pulled up, there was a Capitol Police SUV there with Steve Scalise's detail. Because normally he wouldn't be at the last practice. He's a starting second baseman, but he came that morning. And he wrote a book about the incident called Back in the Game, and in there he talked about how he was originally not going to go to practice that day, but decided to go at the last minute. But because he was there, we had 2 Capitol Police officers there as a detail. And they had pulled their SUV up along the first base line, facing the fence, where they could see onto the field. They could sit in the SUV and they could see Scalise out on the field. Well, it was about, I think, just a little after 7 o'clock. We were winding down practice. We started practice at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so we were right near the end of practice. I had been out in the batting cage. I decided to go up to actually do some live hitting because I was a designated hitter for a Republican team. And I was standing there, just put a batting helmet on, when I heard a gunshot. Now, I live in rural Georgia. We hear gunshots all the time, right? And I always play this game. What was it? Was it a hunting rifle? Was it a handgun? You know, I'm trying to figure out what it was. I also found out in rural Alabama, you hear the same thing. The only difference is after about 3 shots, you hear a propane tank explode in Alabama. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, what then all of a sudden I realized, why am I hearing a gunshot in Alexandria, Virginia? And then I decide, well, do I need to be concerned? So I'm standing at home plate. The shot came out from the third base side. I looked over to the Capitol Police, figured if they look concerned, I'll be concerned. They were exiting their vehicle with a concerned look on their face. There had been a period of time after the gunshot that there was nothing. Then our third baseman, Trent Kelly, hollered, "He's got a gun." At that point, people started running and we started hearing the gunshots, one after another. What had happened is the madman had walked up and he saw Trent Kelly at third base, and he took a shot at him about 10 feet away from the fence. Now, Trent had turned, he saw something, and he was looking right at the rifle. And Trent is a brigadier general in the Army Reserves. I think he was a lieutenant colonel at the time. General, I mean, that was a quick promotion from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general in about a year. But he saw the muzzle flash. The gun pointed directly at his head, but the bullet missed him. We found out later it actually hit one of the links in the chain link fence and deflected away from him.
Wow.
He knew to alert everyone. I immediately started running up the first baseline. Most of my colleagues were heading to the dugout. Now, this is a real dugout. It's not one of the ones that you see in a lot of the new Little League fields with just a fence. This is literally a concrete dugout. this practice field. So a lot of my colleagues were diving into that dugout. My military training kicked back in. That's a kill box. If that gunman gets onto the field, that is going to be a site of a massacre. So I took a longer path to get actually out the gate and off the field. As I was running, I saw the ground explode several times to my left, right in front of me. Jeff Lake, who he had crossed my path, dove in the dugout. He told me at the White House a couple of days later, we were there for an event, he said, what was amazing was the rounds that hit the ground to the right of you. And it didn't dawn on me at the time what he was talking about because I didn't see those. But from the angle the shooter was shooting, for them to hit directly on my right, those bullets basically had to pass between my legs. As I turned to go out the field, I heard a round hit the fence. I realized this guy is targeting me. Now, at 6'3", I was about 50 pounds heavier, and to make it even better, I was wearing a bright yellow jersey. Don't wear yellow to a gunfight. That's what things I wear. As I went out the gate, I didn't realize it, but one of the staff members decided to follow me out the gate instead of going in the dugout. Now, his name is Matt Micah. He is a lobbyist for Chick-fil-A and Tyson's Chicken and some others, but he comes out and he helps us with our baseball. And so he decided to follow me out the gate. As he turned to go out the gate, one of the rounds entered right under his armpit, turned inside of his body, and came out the center of his chest. There was a shed right outside the gate. I got behind this shed because, as we were taught, you get concealment, you find where the aggressor is. If you have means of fighting back, fight back. If not, plan a route of escape. I had no means of fighting back. So I'm going to get there. I'm going to figure out where the shooter is, plan a route of escape. I got behind the shed and knew that I had to work around to the side to where it was looking back toward the backstop to be able to tell where he was. Myself and one of the staff members went around the corner, and that's when I saw Matt Michael walk up to the Capitol Police SUV, which is about 30 feet in front of me, or 20 feet in front of me, turn around, lay down, totally covered in blood. I started hollering, we have a man down, man down. I realized at that point there's no one can do anything to help because we're pinned down with this guy who's fired several rounds at this point. I didn't realize that Scalise had gotten hit. Scalise was hit in about the third shot. As he turned to run away, the bullet went into his hip. The biggest issue with Steve is it didn't come out. So I immediately started to run up to try to help Matt. The guy that was with me, he hollered, said, Barry, get down, get down, get down, as I was running up. And I was getting right near the front of the shed, so I just dove on the ground. And that's when I heard something go, Later that evening, he said, you didn't even flinch when that bullet hit the shed right next to your head. I was like, oh, that's what that was. It's probably a good thing I didn't know what it was at the time. But my eyes were focused on Matt. Because there's Matt with a sucking chest wound and he's bleeding to death. I've got to help Matt. Now, this shooting lasted for 8 minutes. He shot nearly just over 100 times during this time period. The majority of the time was he had worked his way behind the backstop because he was tracking this bright yellow jersey. He was there to kill Republican members of Congress. He actually had an assassination list in his pocket. He was there to kill Republican members of Congress. They were wearing baseball uniforms, so he was targeting those wearing baseball uniforms. So between me and the shooter was a Capitol Police SUV. He took out one of the Capitol Police agents by shooting underneath the SUV. Hit Agent Griner in the ankle, took her down. She was laying right next to Matt Micah, 10 feet in front of me. The whole time I'm focused on getting to him. It's funny, some of the things that go through your mind. One of the things that kept running through my mind was a scene from the movie Hacksaw Ridge. You may have seen that. It's actually one of the stories I'd written in my book long before the movie came out. But Desmond Doss is there, and he kept saying, Lord, help me get one more. And that's what kept running through my mind. Just let me get to Matt. But every time we'd move forward, he would turn and he would start shooting back at us underneath the SUV. The Capitol Police estimated he shot 20-something rounds at me and Brian, who was with me during that time period, because we were the only 2 targets he had left. David Bailey, Capitol Police Officer, would move out to draw fire away, but he had a handgun. He was already on his 3rd magazine of his Glock 19, which holds 17 rounds. I could tell what he was doing was just trying to buy time. He would just try to buy time until more law enforcement could get there. So when they finally took down the perpetrator, I immediately ran up to Matt. He's laying there bleeding. And all of my training immediately came back. Sucking chest wound. What do I need to do? I can't put pressure on it. I don't know what else is damaged. I could puncture his heart. I could do something, I could do more damage. But I do know one thing I can do. I can pray. And the Lord impressed upon me to pray for Matt, and I'm thinking, I don't know his status, Lord. What do I pray for somebody who's going to die? Matt's not going to live, obviously. He's been laying there bleeding profusely for 8 minutes. I don't know how long it's going to take EMTs to get here. What do I pray, Lord? And I can't tell you exactly what I prayed. But I prayed for his healing. That's what I was directed to pray for. It was amazing. My wife and I went to visit Matt in the hospital about 2 weeks later. I didn't even know he knew I was there. But he pulled me up to him and he hugged me. He said, "Thank you for not leaving me." And then I heard him tell somebody, "This is the man who prayed the Lord's Prayer over me." And what's interesting, I didn't pray the Lord's Prayer, but that's what he heard because that's what he could associate with. That's a life-changing experience. That's one of the things that hopefully none of you ever have to endure, to go through a mass shooting. It was about a month and a half later, my wife and I were driving back to Washington, D.C. from Georgia in a rental car. It was about midnight. We were going to stop in Knoxville to spend the night and drive on in the next morning. I was driving about 60 miles an hour in the right-hand lane because we're getting ready to exit. When all of a sudden, this Nissan Rogue we're in lurches forward, turns sideways, and then starts somersaulting down the interstate. I remember Desiree telling me that all she could think was, I'm about to know what it's like to die. So she just see white. I don't know if that were angels or that was airbags slowly hitting you in the face. But then she thought of our kids. And she said, "I heard you saying, 'Jesus help us, Jesus help us.'" Jesus said, "That's a pretty good idea to pray at this moment." It was just natural reaction. When they pulled us out of the vehicle, which ended up on its side, we knew it was a miracle. We knew it was a miracle. We're laying on the side of the interstate waiting for the ambulance to come take us to the hospital. And she looked at me and she said, there's a purpose for this. And I realized, there's a purpose for everything. Now I've been through this shooting, and now I've been through this, what should be a fatal car accident. What happened is somebody ran in the back of us running 110 miles an hour. Never hit the brakes. I think he was distracted, probably looking to his left to change lanes and just slammed right in the back of the car. Wow. Now I've got two things that God has put me through in my life that I can use as a testimony. 2 weeks after that, we've been cooped up at home, cabin fever. My wife says, "We got to get out of here." She had a fractured sternum. I had a lot of back and neck injuries. Weren't sleeping well. She says, "I want to get out of the house." So we decided to go for a drive in the North Georgia mountains. Driving in the divided 4 lanes, she hears something hit the back of the car. She said, "What was that?" I'm like, "There's a rock." See, I'm the guy that if she hears footsteps in the middle of the night, I don't care what it is, it's the wind. If it requires me to get out of the bed, it is the wind. She said, "Wind doesn't sound like footsteps." Well, in this case, it's a unique wind. It's coming down from North Dakota, right? Those winds sound like footsteps. She said, "Rocks don't hit the back of the car." We found an AR round embedded in the back of our car.
Oh my gosh.
When the FBI investigated, they said it had styrations on it, that it had been suppressed. It looks from the trajectory, which was a perfect, when they did the dial trajectory test they do, it was a perfect line to the headrest of the driver. Elevation was off. It said it looks like it was someone laying prone on the side of the highway, waiting for you to come by. Now, it's one thing to be part of a group that someone's trying to kill you because of association with that group. Now it's personal.
Yeah.
Now they're targeting us. And I'm thinking, Lord, what is going on here? Now I've got 3 instances most people would never experience in their life, at least not in combat. Well, bad things happen in 3, so we're good, right? We're good. Actually, it was about 2 months later. We're going to get on an Amtrak train to go to a Republican conference in West Virginia. About halfway there, a garbage truck pulls across the track, and we hit the garbage truck doing about 60 miles an hour. The garbage truck goes flying through the air. She sees it flying through the air. One person comes flying out of it. There was a fatality there, a lot of injuries on the train, partially derailed the train. People won't travel with us anymore. I haven't figured that out. I was sharing this testimony to a group that David brought to Washington, D.C., and I'm sharing this testimony, and afterwards I'm at the Reagan Airport to fly back home, and one of the pastors comes up from Georgia. He says, man, that was an incredible testimony. Will you come to my church and give this testimony? It's just amazing how God's hand of protection is upon you. And I said, I would love to exchange cards. He stops, he looks, he goes, are you on this flight? So you're probably wondering, what does this story have to do with the subject matter here? Engagement in the faith community. I had an epiphany that happened many years ago as I was working on some pro-life legislation when I was in the state Senate. We were very close. It's basically a heartbeat bill that just recently passed. A friend of mine, Ed Setzer, who passed the bill this time. He was working it in the state Senate. I was working, or in the state House. I was working in the state Senate. We were very close to actually getting it out of the Senate and getting a committee hearing in the House. And I was praying that night, Lord, help us get this through. And I started imagining what would it be like if we were able to pass this bill, or any bill, that would make at least some abortions illegal. Or then I started thinking, what if we were to pass a piece of legislation to make all abortions illegal? What would it be like? And you know what the Lord impressed upon me? He was supposed to give me this encouraging word. He said, Barry, if you were to make abortions illegal in Georgia today, there would be a lot of illegal abortions performed in Georgia tomorrow, because you haven't done anything to change the hearts and the minds of the people who are having the abortions. I started thinking about that because when I was pinned down by that shed behind the Capitol Police SUV with bullets whizzing by my head, believe it or not, I never once thought, wait till I get back to the Capitol. I'm going to pass a bill. You know why I never thought that? Because the guy shooting at me had already violated dozens of federal and state laws. He had no respect for law, so there's no law we could pass that would have changed that situation one bit. He was there to commit murder, the most heinous of crimes, the taking of someone's life. Another misdemeanor wouldn't have made a difference to him. When we were sitting on the side of the interstate waiting on the ambulance, I never once thought, well, you wait till I pass a bill. You know, speeding is already illegal, distracted driving is illegal. There's nothing I could do by law that would have changed one thing. It's also illegal to shoot at people when they're in a car or try to assassinate someone. And you know what? It's illegal to cross around those crossing guards at railroad tracks. And so I realized that there is nothing that we can do as legislators to change the major incidences or the major issues in this nation today. And we have to realize where our limits are. But what can we do? How can we be effective? Because law cannot change evil. Only Jesus can change evil by changing the hearts and minds of the people. So the Lord led me in a direction, and this is really where we ended up. There are those that can influence our culture. It's hard for us to do it. Look, I literally lost friends and family in the first week in Congress, right? When I took the oath of office, when I went to the State House, I lost friends. Why? Because I'm part of them now. When we talk, we're lying to a lot of people. That's the way they perceive it. You're a politician, therefore I can't trust you. But there are people in our communities that the people trust. And that's the leaders in the faith community. But the problem we have in the faith community is they're so distant from politics. They really a lot of our pastors don't even understand the basics of what David teaches and Tim teaches on a daily basis, that our nation was founded upon those basic principles of morality and biblical truths, and that freedom comes from God. And government's responsibility is to protect those freedoms. So we needed a way of engaging it. So I had started having these listening lunches is what we call them. And so I started just inviting the pastors in each one of the counties to come. I'll buy your lunch and we'll sit around the table and we'll just talk. And as we were talking, I started telling them about the Bible studies we have in Washington and the church service we have on Wednesday night inside of the Capitol. And they're amazed. You mean there's more than just one Christian up there? I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of evangelical Christians. I said, you need to come to Washington, D.C. and see what's going on. I never thought they'd take me up on it, but they did. They went and got a bus, and 40 of them, they went and, from pastors from multiple churches, came to Washington, D.C. I'm like, okay, we got to figure this out. So I called David. David said, look, you get the facilities, you get the meeting rooms, we'll handle the program. It was life-changing. 40 pastors from my home county came to Washington, D.C., spent 3 days, and left there transformed. One of the pastors told me, he said, I have been in the ministry for 30 years. I've done every conference, church building, everything you can think of, and the 3 days I just spent here with you guys has been more valuable than all that put together. One of the black pastors from one of the black churches in our community was standing in Statuary Hall, and David Martin was talking about Lincoln and his fight for abolition, and the biblical stance of the pastors that were involved in that. And I saw him turn around and he said, I've been lied to all my life. Not even realizing the impact the faith community had on the establishment of our nation. Man, this is a good deal. So we decided let's do it again. So we brought another group of pastors up. The same response. Now it's starting to reverberate about the community. Now we have business leaders coming to us and saying, how can we participate to bring more pastors, because we're seeing a change in the community because of what they're doing and what they're experiencing. So let me just give you an illustration. Now this is the first group we brought up from Bartow County, Georgia. 40 plus pastors and their spouses. They go back, multiple denominations. Black, white, Hispanic churches, they're all Methodist, Presbyterian, or Pentecostal, Baptist, lots of Baptist churches. In Georgia, there's like 5 Baptist churches for every other denomination. And so, even my pastor from Oakland Heights Baptist Church came up. And they got back and said, you know, the only way this is going to be life-changing is if we continue this back here. So they started meeting. And they started meeting weekly. What can we do to change this community? So one of them goes to the school superintendent of the county, says, what do you need? So, well, there's a correlation between reading levels and 3rd grade reading and prison population. Believe it or not, there's a direct correlation. The poorer they do at reading in the 3rd grade, the more likely they're going to end up incarcerated. So the churches got together and said, let us help. Because they realized it wasn't just the reading, it had to be something else involved. And usually it's a family situation. So they started getting volunteers from their churches, multiple denominations, and they're going into every school. And they're sitting and working with the teachers on 3rd grade reading, and the results have been phenomenal.
Huh?
They're finding out that there's kids that are having a hard time reading, and they find out they just slept the night in a car. So now they go to one of the shelters that we have in the community, and they work with that shelter to provide them some housing and to help them get back on their feet. Another issue that we're facing is startup homes. We have a lot of manufacturing that is booming again. I went to one of the manufacturers, we did a tour of the plant, and I said, what's your number one issue? I assumed it would be trade and tariffs. Is their number one issue is the lack of starter homes. We have a lot of new employees that want to buy a home, but they're just not available. So what they've done is started this faith community, the same group that we brought to Washington, D.C., has now created a 501c3. They're working with the county government because the developers, there's a lot of property, a lot of land available from the recession. There's still a lot of developments out there, but they're waiting till that price comes up where they can build $250,000 homes instead of, now in Georgia, a $250,000 home is a pretty good sized home. 140, 150,000 in range is where we're lacking. So what they've done is developed a 501c3 working with the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Secretary Sonny Perdue, for grant to help them set this up. They're raising money. They're going to buy property. They're going to develop it and sell it at cost. It's 501c3. Why? Because we got the faith community engaged to actually resolve the problems that the communities are facing, instead of just running to government to try to fix all the problems. There are multiple ways you can engage in the faith community, because if you want to change the face of your state, you want to change the face of your community and the face of the nation, is empower the pastors, empower the faith leaders, empower those that are doing the community services to do more. And a lot of them are eager to do more, but I mean, have a whole team of constituent services. All they do all day, every day, is deal with people's problems. And I'm sure we could all write a pretty fabulous book about the problems. I remember one guy when I was in state legislature, he would call almost every other day, wanting me to go to the pharmacy and tell the pharmacist that he has to give him this prescription. Well, what makes you think I do that? Well, you're my state representative. He'll listen to you. I mean, we all have a heart of service, but we first have to understand what we can affect and what we can't. And then identify those who can and engage and empower them. And that's as simple as this whole program is bringing those who can change the face of our communities, who can make a difference. You want to end school shootings? Take the evil out of the heart of the shooter. You don't, look, when this guy was shooting at me, never once did I see that gun jump up off the ground and just start shooting. There was a man with evil in his heart looking down that barrel, aiming it at me and shooting. That gun didn't create the problem. Let me tell you, the problem that was created is none of us had a way of defending ourselves because Washington, D.C. prohibits handguns. So, if we want to change the community, and look, it's all back to supply and demand, right? It's supply and demand. If you remove the supply of evil, then people won't demand so much government to try to end it.
That's right.
But you got to get to their homes. And each one of you live in a different community. The makeup of your churches are different. And so I don't have a formula of how it's going to work in your community. I have a formula how it is working, and we're always modifying it in Georgia. But the first step is to engage. And we found the engagement is buying meals for pastors is a great way of getting them to come to the table, right? And no agenda. And once the word starts going, these lunches that we do regularly now are growing and growing. My wife has learned that I can go to a business group and we can have one of these lunch meetings that last an hour. That ain't going to happen with the pastors. It's going to last for 3 hours. And so we know to just budget half of the day. But we both walk out of that room transformed. And you will learn so much about what their ideas, the ideas that they're getting just from their churches, their congregations, and TV of what politics is about. Some of them actually believe that it is illegal for them to even discuss major issues of the day from the pulpit. And the left knows this. That's why they're politicizing everything. That's why freedom of religion is politicized today, because they're afraid to talk about basics of abortion, homosexuality, and all of the basic biblical truths that we have all accepted, that you have a freedom of religion and a freedom of expression and the freedom of speech to talk about. But it's been politicized because they want to make it politically incorrect, because they know they can minimize the cultural change agents in this nation by doing it. The only way you're going to change that is to empower them. So I see I'm running low on time here, and we want to take some questions. So you may have, Tim, are you going to moderate that? Okay.
Any questions?
Todd Rush, Oklahoma State House. Appreciate you being here, and I'm glad you're engaging with the pastors. It seems like one of the things that is happening, the pastors are so intimidated from the possibility of attacks from the left. Do you see some way that we can get the pastors to unify under a single voice so they don't go out and pick off your church and this denomination and that denomination, but put that voice under one big umbrella and just come out with the church says and let them push back against that way?
You know, that is working, that very idea is working. It kind of organically grew in my home county, because once we got them together, they were in one mind and one accord, and they were in unison. And so the Methodist Church is defending the Baptist Church. They're working together in unison, and I think once you get them going, that will naturally occur. But they did ask me to come and speak. It was one of the churches brought some pastors in and a lot of the leaders from the churches, and it was called Men of Valor, and they asked me to come share my testimony. And as I'm walking in, the Lord put upon my heart, you're going to phrase this of what are you afraid of? Because it's fear, and God has not given us a spirit of fear. And I go through my testimony. And as I was sitting in chair one night, or one morning, early morning when I was doing the devotion, I was praying, God, why am I going through all this? And what Pastor Tim said last night really resonated, because the Lord said you should be taking joy. Oh, really? I'm supposed to be happy people are shooting at me? Yeah. Because Romans tells us take joy in tribulation, because tribulation gives you patience or perseverance. Perseverance builds your character or gives you experience, and experience hope. And Hebrews 1:11 tells us, what is the definition of faith? The things that are hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. So how are you going to build your faith? By going through the bad stuff, learning to persevere, and the experience that you went through it before, and God's going to lead you through. And so I'm sharing this with him, and I said, look, I've been shot at, run over, an assassination attempt, and in a train wreck. What are you afraid of? God has brought me through. And the comforting thing of all these scriptures, we considered ourselves soldiers of Christ. I shared this with him, right? We're soldiers for Christ. 2 Peter tells us, join me in the tribulation as a soldier of Christ. Wow. He didn't say, join me in this massive victory. He said, join me in the tribulation, because we know, as we talked about earlier, that you don't get victory unless you're fighting. So sometimes the reality has to set in with them. If you're a pastor, you're going to face controversy if you're doing what God is telling you to do, especially when the culture is adverse to the scriptures. But yet God is there for you. He will bring you through, and you may suffer some decline in your church. And I'm not going to promise that it's going to get better, but one thing these pastors have learned is it's quality over quantity that makes a difference in the kingdom of God. Amen. And some of them have told me, I've lost people, but yet the people that have come in are a breath of fresh air. They're so new. And so I think organically you'll see this unity, but it's sometimes they just have to realize they're in it too.
Thank you. Congressman, I'm Woody Burton from Indiana, and recently, and I want to see if this, you've heard about this on a national level, in Indiana we have we're big on school vouchers in private schools, and the religious schools have their classes also. Currently, the Catholic Church in Indianapolis is under attack because they hired a lady who later started telling everybody she was married to another lady. And she signed a contractual agreement when she went in to go by the faith of that church. Since then, that school dropped out of the diocese, the archdiocese. Another school was attacked. It's not dropping out of it, and they're taking it to a lawsuit. Is this a national trend?
It is, yeah.
Is there something you could recommend about that?
Well, this is where we have to take the attitude. And I want to take this back to something Paul Ryan said on the House floor. This was several hours after the baseball shooting. We were all, finally, it was about 10:30 or so, I was able to get back to the Capitol. Paul Ryan, who was speaker at the time, called the entire House into session at noon. We canceled everything else for the day, but he addressed the House. And the words he said have resonated with me in so many different ways. He said, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. And when it comes to the body of Christ, we have to take that approach. The attack on the Catholic Church is an attack on the Baptist Church. It's an attack on the Methodist Church. And that's when I think the unity of Christ comes together and we publicly defend them from a multi-denominational standpoint. It goes back to what he was talking about, unity. We have to learn, and that's what probably one of the greatest factors of this pastor's program that we put together is the unity that evolved from it that wasn't there before. And I think, you know, there's some things we can do legislatively that, as I was sharing with some this morning, it's impossible to get anything done in Washington. You know, if people look for Washington to fix our problems, it's taken me 5 years to get a simple land transfer bill through that was non-controversial, where one of our counties wanted to donate some historical Civil War property to a national battlefield. No one was against it. It took 5 years to get the thing through. And so people keep looking for Washington to do something. They get frustrated with Washington. I'm frustrated with Washington weekly, but the best way to attack this is for unity among the churches. That's really where, and basically God tells us to share the burden, right? So we're going to share the burden with our Catholic brothers and sisters. If you're going to attack the Catholics, you're going to attack us. You're going to attack the Methodist Church. You're going to attack the independent church here. We're going, in this community, we're going to stand together. And I think, you know, it's not going to stop the media from what they're doing, but it's, when you do that, that's newsworthy enough to where it's going to promulgate around the community, even if it's just the pastors telling their congregations, this is what we're doing because we're standing for Christ.
Over here.
Thank you. My question is about the 501c3 status for the religious community or 501. I think that as a Christian body, we're kind of being lured into something, and I would really hope that maybe you can think of it in terms of a reverse psychology, because it gives the federal government opportunity for control over what we can and can't do, and we are not getting a pushback from the church community like, no, we have the first right, we own the right from God, and you don't have that right to step in and give us a category that sidelines the church community. Is there anything that you can do at that level to really rethink the paradigm of the 501 for churches, because we really have superiority or ultimate authority above and outside of that tax status?
Well, probably the biggest issue with that is the Johnson Amendment, that which we have made efforts to repeal. It's not going to get repealed in this Congress. We got very close during the last Congress when Republicans were in control. And I think we've learned some things as the American people expect us to do some of these things. As hard as it is to get things through the Senate, we need to use leverage in the House a little more there. We got very close to being able to repeal the Johnson Amendment. The President has said he will support it, and he'll try to do what he can through executive order on it. But there's also an educational element to that. Technically, from my understanding, is the Johnson Amendment just basically says the church can't endorse a candidate, right? But it doesn't say anything that they can't stand for principles, the ideas of life, liberty, sanctity of marriage. And what's happened is the left has convinced churches that they have to be apolitical. And that is not the truth. And that's one of the things that David addresses with these pastors that we're bringing in. And we've done more than just bringing pastors to Washington, D.C. Sometimes it's easier to get David to come to our community and bring the pastors in for some time there. And or take some of his, we've even bought some of his DVDs and given them to pastors to actually, then they want to come to our program in Washington, D.C. But it's an educational element saying, no, you are not restricted. And it's amazing how some of the most conservative pastors, their eyes are open saying, what, I can be preaching this from the pulpit and not be scared of the IRS? Absolutely. But it is going to take a level of courage on their part. And that's the thing I emphasize to them. You've got to be bold. You've got to be bold for Christ, but bold in a loving and caring way and standing for Jesus. But continuing to repeal the Johnson Amendment is probably the one thing that will bring the relief that they're working for. I have known some churches that just said, forget it, we'll pay taxes so I can preach the gospel.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. First of all, Eric Porterfield, West Virginia House of Delegates, first term. You've talked about engaging in our faith community. I believe that that's them being engaged in politics is what's allowing a lot of these bad things to get through. People love our vote, but they hate our voice oftentimes. With your connection program that you have there, knowing the different doctrinal positions that churches have or differences that they may have, do you have a certain set agenda items as what we're battling for, like First Amendment, religious liberty, life, sanctity of marriage, things we all agree on? This is where we're going to stay, and we're not going to get outside of any of that. That way, I could see that potentially being a problem in my own area.
Right.
Could you give me a way to try to set up something like that as far as what's your common ground we're battling for, so that you can get these different groups linked together? And have you had some issues on that, and how did you resolve that? Thank you.
The first part is developing a relationship, because as I said, we're politicians, so they're going to take anything we say with skepticism. People are always going to think you have some kind of angle for that. For instance, one of the pastors that came to our first group in Washington, I overheard him tell, maybe David or Tim or someone else, is, I thought this was going to be some Republican promotional trip, but wow, this is totally different. Here's the way we handle that, because I know that exists in people's minds. I develop enough relationship that says, I want you to come to Washington, D.C. I'm going to support you coming, but I'm not going to be doing, I do one small portion, as we'll bring other legislators in from the House and Senate to speak. But David and Tim, they talk to policy issues, right? They're the ones who are actually bringing it, but they bring it from a historical and biblical perspective. When you start talking about John Quincy Adams talking about his dad, who totally believed that life began in the womb, and you talk about Blackstone, who actually wrote in the commentaries on the common law that life begins the protection of life begins at the first stirring within the woman's womb. I mean, this goes back into the 1600s. They're bringing it from a historical, biblical perspective. And now it's a more trusted agent that's bringing this forward instead of me. The other aspect to be concerned of, some people, is what about the liberal churches? If you present this in a certain way, the liberal churches aren't coming. They're going to understand where you are. They're not going to participate in this. And quite frankly, there's a book out that's called The Myth of the Death of the Church. Forget the authors. Folks in the family came to Washington, D.C., presented the studies. It was phenomenal. That what we're seeing is the churches that are actually dying in America is the way he terms it, rainbow flag churches.
Huh?
They're the ones that are dying. Evangelical, independent churches are actually growing, and Christianity is growing. And so, we just kind of allow it to filter itself through, because there's a couple of liberal churches in our home community, but they've expressed no interest in learning truth. So, but I think actually setting it up to let somebody who is a more trusted agent, and in this case we have, it was the chairman of the Bartow Baptist Association we went to with this idea. He actually went out and used his connections through all the churches. And so he was the trusted agent, said, hey, I want you to go with me to do this. I think it's going to be phenomenal. And so instead of me doing the invitation, I build a relationship, but I find somebody who has influence over them to get them to come. And then when they get there, he's already recommending David and Tim and the whole Walbuilders team, so there's actually some relationship there. It's all about relationships and trust, and you have to find, I hate to use the word angle, but you have to actually find the angle that you can get in there to build the trust, to get the truth to it.
Last question?
Yep.
What did it cost for that to happen? is what he's asking.
They're paying for it themselves. The churches are paying for it. I don't know because they actually fund, they get the buses, they buy their own airline tickets. Now, because of the popularity of this, we have members in the business community, evangelicals and businesses, they actually want to help fund this. So we're trying to figure out, do we create a 501c3 that's totally separate, that just works with this? So this is something we're going through right now, but we realize this, I mean, we stepped into something very important, and we need to make sure it continues on. And as we can actually get this funding, I don't necessarily want it to be totally funded, because I think you'll have less participation if they don't have some skin in the game. But if we can actually have some funding available for them, scholarships for some of them who couldn't afford to go otherwise, that would help. But I can't tell you what the cost is. I know from Atlanta it's cheaper to fly Southwest than Delta, and they usually get group rates. So, they did the bus one time, and even pastors don't want to be on a bus for 12 hours together. So they decided, we're going to fly from now on.
Congressman Loudermilk, thank you for your message, and thanks for being here. It's great stuff. I want to go back for a moment to the question about the Johnson Amendment, because I think it's the first thing that popped into most of our minds is, yeah, if we could only get rid of that. And as you point out, it's narrow. The other thing that occurs to me, though, is that with changes in tax law, with the so-called Trump tax cuts that you all passed, the significance of the charitable deduction is very different today.
It is.
And so the question is, if that went away, would it be a big deal? I mean, if a church,
Yeah.
you know, so let them rattle their sabers, and if they really came after him, would it really matter for the most part?
It was kind of mixed feelings in on this, because it did significantly reduce the deduction you can take through charitable giving. But what we were trying to do is reduce the number of exemptions and deductions to clean up the tax code. You know, cut taxes, make it simpler. We do have some legislation I just signed on to that would basically allow an employer to set up a charitable giving account for you, and you can actually have money deducted directly from your payroll that goes to the employer, and they make regular contributions. It's basically set up like a health savings account, but then that is an additional deduction to your taxes. That's a way of actually helping in the giving side, but yet it doesn't play into the narrative of, you know, but you're right, if it actually does go away, then we don't have to worry about it anymore, right?
My point is, should churches fear it now, because it's far less significant than it used to be, so should the Johnson Amendment be that scary?
Yeah, it really shouldn't. I think it's more perception of repealing it than anything. I think it's admirable that we do recognize the importance of churches and we give them the tax exemption. But like I said, there's some churches that said, I will not let the government control what I say from the pulpit, and I'll just exempt myself if I need to. That's a great point. Thank you all, first of all, for what you do. For the members, the spouses, everybody who is serving, thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for the heart that you have. One of the quotes that has meant the most to me, and I'll leave you with this, is kind of defines what we fight for. It was John Adams who said, our Constitution is for religious and moral people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other.
That's right.
Why did he say that? Because they established a form of government different from any other. The Constitution is a limit on government. It limits government power. They wanted a small government. It wasn't intrusive in your life. The only way that you can have a small government that exists to protect the rights of others is when you have a moral society that themselves respect other rights. Because when you have a moral society, you're less likely to violate someone else's rights, so you can get by with a small government. What we have to do is return to that basic of true morality in our nation, the principles our founders believed so much in, and you're on the front line fighting that, and I think together we can keep winning if we just hold together and be strong. Thank you guys for what you're doing. God bless you.